Hey, kia ora, everyone. My name is Steven Moe, and I'm a partner at Parry Field Lawyers. So I just held a masterclass, a governance masterclass, last week for Selwyn District Council. Thank you very much for the invite to come along. There was about 35 community groups that came and joined in an hour-long session, and we were talking about the principles of good governance. And the way we did it was with a framing around 7 practical questions. They're outlined in this guide. And so that's what this session was doing, going through this guide. If you look in the little description of this video, I'll have put a link to this guide so you can get it as well. It's basically some practical, before you join a board, part 1, a well-run meeting. And then we run through the questions, and then we run through the answers as well. So that's what I was doing. And it was quite dynamic. There's lots of people asking questions and commenting. So I've gone through and edited that. That was about an hour and a half long. I've edited out the bits where people were just discussing in their little groups. So it's going to just go straight from question to question to question, 7 of them. So I really hope this is helpful. We put up a lot of content at www.parryfield.com. So you can have a look there for more resources. And there's another video which is looking at chairing the board. What are the key things you need to know as a chair of a board or as someone who's supporting the chair of the board? So we're just trying to get information out so that governance across Aotearoa New Zealand can improve. And this is one example. If you need more information, we've done a charities legal handbook, a startups legal toolkit, social enterprise book, a book on reimagining business. There's lots of resources. So we hope this is helpful. I hope that it's a nice deep dive into good governance for you and that it's something that would be of use to your governance positions. Thanks very much for listening. And the last thing is that there is a podcast called Board Matters that I've done for the Institute of Directors. 13 interviews with very experienced people. Check that out. There'll be a link in the description. And I've also been doing Seeds, which there's 346 interviews of inspiring people about what motivates them and why they do what they do. So check those out as well. Now let's get into this governance masterclass. This recording because I had a bunch of people contact me saying I can't make it, but I'd like to know what you talked about. So that's the reason. Well, mainly for the two of you, since you weren't here before, my name is Steven Moe, and I work as a partner in a law firm, Parry Field Lawyers. And my job, I view, is to keep you safe and to educate about governance and the rules of the game. What are the lines that we need to stay within when we're playing the game of governance? So I'm a lawyer, but I'm also a director of companies myself. Just to give new information to the rest of the group, I'm actually on 8 different boards. So that's quite a lot of boards. And that's a whole discussion topic, which is how many board positions is too many board positions? Because at some point you can no longer do the job well if you're on too many. I think I'm fine because the ones I'm on don't require, it's not like a weekly thing or anything. It's more like a quarterly thing or less than some boards would require. And it's also a stage of my life. I know this is a time for me to be really busy and to be active. But that's another topic. So we went through these questions about chairing a board. So if you're interested, I did record that earlier session, so hopefully we'll be able to make that available. And this next part, we just called it good governance, I think. And if you saw it, it's what is good governance? We're going to be looking at some skills that I think would be helpful. So this is going to be a little bit different to the first part, because I don't want you to all get bored sitting there. I would love for you to have a bit of interaction. So what we're going to be doing is going through this resource here, which has been, it even has the beautiful logo on the front of Selwyn District Council. So it's been handmade for tonight. So you're very lucky to be receiving this because it doesn't really exist apart from here. And what I'm going to be doing is going through a few scenarios that I see come up for boards all the time. Like, if you can do this stuff well, you're going to be okay. That's how I view it. So we're going to be going through some really practical points. But what I would like you to do is potentially move next or near to some people. So there's, say, 3 of you or 4 of you who you can then talk to, because I don't want this to be about me just talking the whole time. I want to be able to ask you, what do you think? What would you do? Because learning by doing, right? It's going to be far more effective if you've actually thought through rather than just listening to me talk. As great as I am at talking, right? It's much more effective for your learning if you're actually talking and with other people. I should say as well that the governance side of things, I think, is something that none of us are taught naturally. Like, it's not like you come out of high school and, oh, you did the governance course. It doesn't happen. And people just naturally assume, if you've been asked to join a board, or if you've joined a board, that somehow at the first meeting, you're going to know about governance. But that's not actually how it works. It's a skill. It's like riding a bike. It's like learning a game. You have to practice and you have to be taught and learn. So that's what this is really for. As we're going through it, I would welcome your questions, because I would love to know what you're thinking. I'm going to start just by going through how I think I see things going wrong. So if you turn to page 4, that's where I'm going to be looking at the bottom. The ways that I see governance going wrong at the bottom of page 4 is blurring of lines between governance and management. Who's doing what? Is it the governance or is it management? Management is the details, and governance is the high-level strategy. Where are we headed? I see decision-making that's happening without full sets of information. I see conflicts of interests that are undeclared. I see people not understanding the purpose of the organization. What are we actually here for? Maybe sounds surprising, but it's oftentimes the case. People don't even know why they're there. The roles and scope of work being confused, not asking questions. So just as an example there, I've said wrongful subordination, for example, like to a head pastor in a religious group or to a chair of the board. Passivity, don't just say yes, ask questions. Strategy, or the lack of it. Failing to ask, what does success look like? Like, what are we here for? As a side note, I think for many, if many are coming from charities, I think sometimes success for us is that we don't exist. Like, we've solved the problem. And sometimes I see charities getting so caught up in their own hype and how great they are, that it's like a self-perpetuating machine. And they're no longer trying to get to the root cause of the problem that leads to them being necessary. And they're more focused on, we have to preserve the brand and potentially the job of the CEO or whatever. So that can be a problem. And then passive board members who are not engaged with real issues. Like, I hope at the end of this session, one of the lessons you'll take is that you really need to be asking questions. That's one of your primary roles of being on a board, is to push, ask questions. And if you're not happy with the answer, ask another question, because you as a board member are bringing a different perspective from everybody else around the table. So I put in a really self-promoting page on number 5, which is, when should you seek legal input? Quite often we see people come to us after the problem has happened, and it's much harder to unpick and much harder to deal with things. So usually it's best to actually get advice and input if you're unsure. And then page 6 is resources. So I want you to go away feeling like you know where to go for more resources. For those who just joined, I mentioned this Seeds podcast where I've interviewed 346 inspiring people about their life stories. So that's a good way to learn from others and what they've done. But there's a whole bunch of free resources on governance that I've put there, as well as for charities and for-purpose organizations. And then Board Matters at the bottom is the podcast I've done for the Institute of Directors, who, 13 short episodes, 10 minutes, with amazing people in governance. So easy. I didn't mention this in the first part of the session, so those of you who were there, you'll notice that I'm always using the terms for-purpose organizations. And I want to just spend a moment on that. I think that the sector that we're probably all involved in is doing itself a great disservice by starting what it is with the words not. Because I think terminology matters. And we talk about the not-for-profit sector. So there's no other part of our life where we start describing who we are by what we are not. Like, we don't do that. We usually frame things in a positive way. And then the second part of that is not for profit. So we're defining ourselves by profit. Yeah. We're defining ourselves in relation to companies. Like, we are not for profit. So I much prefer a different term, which is broader, which is for purpose. For purpose. And I think that is a reframing that we could take into our organizations and our groups. Instead of saying we are a not-for-profit, say we are a for-purpose organization. Might take a little bit of explaining to people, like, what? I thought you were an NFP. But we've got to start somewhere. And so I've seen groups across the country change how they're describing themselves. And even the accountants in Auckland, there's a group called the Chartered Accountants of Australia and New Zealand, and they have what used to be called the not-for-profit special interest group. Because of this discussion, we've convinced them to change to the for-purpose special interest group. So change is happening. So why not join me and ride the wave of different terminology? So can you now go into a small group, like could be 3 of you here maybe, and then the 4 of you, and then maybe the 3 of you, 4 of you, and can you briefly just introduce yourself, like what's your name, which group are you from? And then we're going to run through some questions, okay? And why don't, actually, yeah, that's a great idea. Just, yeah, move your chairs around and everything. So I'm going to read the first question, and then you're going to talk about it, okay? So before you join a board, you have recently been asked if you would be interested in becoming a board member of a charity. You're excited by this because you've been involved as a volunteer for more than 10 years, and you think there's lots of opportunities to serve others by taking on this role. The group has faced recent challenges, but it has made it through COVID and also has some new initiatives which will further support your local community, including considering setting up a preschool, a cafe, a counseling service. After talking with others about it, you feel like this is the right step to take. All right, so then there's 3 questions. So can you just introduce yourself, which group are you from? And then run through those 3 questions and have a little discussion among yourself, what you think the answers are. All right, should we come back together? If we answer the solve the problems of the world, we can finish up now. What we'll do is we'll just go through each of the questions, and then we will think about what the answers are. Does anybody want to be brave and volunteer? What questions would you be asking before you join a board? Yep.
Yeah, so for me, doing my community group, it was around time commitment.
Yep.
So I just finished up with a volunteer role to focus on my stuff, and then this role came up.
Yep.
So for me, that was really important to understand what the expectations were of my time as a volunteer and
right.
in that chair role. So,
right.
Yeah.
Great. Any other questions you would ask? Yes.
If, and if so, how is the position compensated?
Right. So is there compensation for this position? That's a great question. Yeah, there's often assumptions made that there is or there isn't. Yeah, it's good.
And
to
it
be clear.
may feel greedy to ask when you're involved in a for-purpose organisation whether or not there's compensation, but that comes hand in hand with how much you'll be giving in terms of time, resources, knowledge.
Yes.
Things like that.
Yeah. No, that's good. I mean, obviously every group's going to be different, whether they can afford to compensate, but as a general principle, I think it's a positive thing. The one legal bit would be, what does your trust deed say, or what does your constitution say? Because sometimes there are limits on what you're allowed to do when it comes to compensation, because whoever set it up may have said there will be no compensation. And then the answer is quite simple. Although for many trustees, like I'd be interested, when was the last time any of you got out your founding document and had a look at what it says? Because I think for the vast majority of people, it's sitting in a drawer somewhere and hasn't been looked at for a long time. So, but often there's things in it that you really should know. And in fact, the new Trust Act 2019, which came into force in 2021, that's one of your duties as a trustee, is to know the terms of your trust. So you actually have an obligation to know what your rules say. And actually, if you want to add value, when you go to your board and you say, hey, did anybody see in the rules that before we have a meeting, we're meant to give 2 weeks notice? Or like, probably everybody's going, what? What are you talking about? So you'll come out as like wow, they really know their stuff. The other thing about trustees is that they can always be modified. Well, as long as there's a variation clause. But I would encourage you to be looking at your founding documents and doing a sanity check of, does this still apply? Because when it was drafted in 1971, that was how they did things. But it's now 2023, by the last time I checked. We probably should update the document to reflect how we actually act. So I see a massive disconnect between what's written in the document and what you actually do. For any of you who are in corporate societies, you're going to need to re-register. So you're about to be forced to ask this question. And I think it's a healthy question to be asked. I'm not going to go into the detail of what if our trustees said we're meant to give 14 days notice, and are any of our meetings for the last 20 years, have any of them been valid? Because we never have complied with what our rules say. It's an interesting question. The reality is that nobody's going to come knocking on the door. Like, nobody wants to force charities to do things, you know, but that's what your rules say. You should be compliant. How about what documents should you be asking to see? Yeah.
Constitution.
Yeah, the Constitution or the trust deed, depending on your organization, have a different name. But if you're a charity, you will have a founding document. So you might not have seen it, but it exists. You can download it for free from Charity Services, which is the regulator. So you enter the name of your charity, it will be there under documents. So they're not hard to find. Although another point is, if it says 1971, has it been updated and just nobody ever uploaded a new version? That happens a lot more than you think. So making sure that the register is kept up to speed is a good thing. I think as well, you know, the board charter idea I mentioned earlier, getting a copy of that. So board charter, for those of you who are new, basically sets out how the board operates. What are the expectations of people who join, time commitments, the role of the chair, what are you there for? So that's something that can be a helpful tool. And I've said IOD, that stands for Institute of Directors. So they have a free board charter on their site. So that's a pretty good price. Before I would join a board, I would also ask to see previous meeting minutes to get a sense of what is talked about. You know, confirmation potentially, if you can afford it. Is there any insurance in place to give me some cover? How about the third one? What sort of duties are you subject to as a trustee? What liabilities might result if they're breached? That's a fun topic, isn't it?
Is that a risk register?
Yeah,
Like to a certain degree, like that would show me like.
a risk register is a good idea. Yeah, yeah. Also a conflict of interest register is usual. There's kind of three basic duties for trustees. The duty to act in good faith and honestly, to know and act in accordance with the trust, and to act to further the trust purposes. So those are, like, to summarize it, those are the core things that you need to be doing. So one thing I would say is knowing what your purpose is really, really important. And sometimes I see charities, see if this resonates with any of you, started 25 years ago. The purpose is very clear. We're here to provide education for preschool students. Oh, there's some funding available for primary school students. Let's go get that funding. Oh, look, there's some suicide prevention funding for high school students. We could apply for that. Oh, there's some funding available for university students getting into the workforce. All of a sudden, are you even within the purposes that you were set up for? So you just have to always be asking the question, what is our purpose? What are we actually here for? And I see too many people get diverted off into distraction. So I see some of you writing notes, which is really awesome, and I encourage that. But why don't you turn the page and see that I put the answers. So you were hoping that that was going to be the case. So I just listed there my thoughts. I want to say as well, this isn't like, these are my thoughts. It's not like an exhaustive textbook list, but in my mind, these are some of the things, you know, you touched on it. What's the expected time commitment? Are there any, what's my motivation for joining? Are there specific skills that the board is seeking? Can I attend a meeting to see how they run? Who else is on the board? Google them. Talk to the chair. What's their leadership style? Don't get into something before you know what you're getting into. So let's turn to part 2. Great, your appointment has gone through. You're excited to have people congratulate you. You're excited to attend your first meeting, and you wait for some information about it. Nothing comes. About an hour before the start, there's a hastily written note from the chair by email which says, see you soon, here's some financials. There's no agenda, no papers on strategy, no briefings or reports. You arrive for the 7:30 p.m. and you find that the first 30 minutes is spent waiting for others. Turns out 3 of the 7 are busy and can't attend. The meeting drifts from topic to topic, seemingly without structure, until you finish late, but without any real decisions. Is this how meetings always go? So I hear some laughs, and it's probably because you've been in these meetings, right? Like this, unfortunately, it's not that far from reality for many groups. So in your group, can you run through the 3 questions there? Maybe just spend like a minute or 2 on each one, and then we'll come back as a group. All right, why don't we come back together? So it's good, hearing lots of good discussion out there, so that's good. What does anybody want to volunteer? Any best practice thoughts on attendance, agendas, minutes, communications? Yes.
So I shared what we do in our organisation. We meet monthly, and
Yep.
even Wednesday of every month.
Okay,
So everybody knows when it is all the time. They don't need to remember a date or a time.
nice.
Our agenda is put out physically
Yep.
and online 2 weeks before. That first week is whānau adding agenda items that they'd like to discuss. The second week is me reviewing the agenda and going through those items, defining which I can discuss with that whānau directly,
Right,
just to trim down the amount of agenda items
Yep.
and which need to be discussed as a whole.
that's wonderful. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I think having a clear timing is really important. And that's a good, you know, like it's this Wednesday of the month. Because I don't know about you, but getting emails from people saying, oh, the next meeting is on the 17th of whatever, and then the next one is on the 5th, and then the next one, it's like,
You know, I can't make it.
Consistent.
The 22nd work for you, no, but the 23rd does. Oh, I've got something on. How about the 24th?
yeah, it's
So
really,
always the second Wednesday, you say, I've got something on that night, and you rearrange other things.
Yeah, that's right. So it's a priority.
What if you just can't get enough, so let's see what it's like. Enough people on the meeting.
Like the forum.
Yeah.
Usually that only happens when, like not enough people attend. But the basis of Kohanga is that it's very cost effective, and the only expectation from whānau is to attend 1 week a month. So we're only paying $5 an hour for childcare. They don't have to come in and volunteer like a lot of other Kohanga do. They require matua ake as part of their structure. We don't ask for that. We only ask for 1 or 2 hours. Yeah, so there's also a policy in place where if they miss 2 but it's been like with the meetings without giving any previous apologies, their child is moved to the top of the waiting list. When they start showing more interest in the kaupapa, then they put back in. So no one's given their place. And we haven't never had to do it.
Right.
So yeah, our issue is not being enough, but they have to postpone again.
Right.
Yeah, this happens a lot over winter. Whether it's sickness or people use sickness as an excuse because it's winter. During, because we only have to have 8 meetings per year plus our AGM, we tend to use 2 of those to not hold a hui at all for that month. And then the other 2 will hold online. So there's really no excuse. If you're sick, you can be sick on the computer.
Yeah. All right. You had a thought.
Our whole committee is organised on our Facebook page.
Yep.
So your our meetings are set up as an event, so people can tick attending, not attending, so
Okay.
you know exactly who's going to be there.
Yep.
And yeah, minutes are posted pretty much as we walk out the door.
And that works pretty well.
On fire. But yeah, just the agenda, like there's a set pattern. It's the same day of every month,
Right.
time, and yeah, the agenda is out 2 weeks beforehand. It's just sort of
Nice.
explaining.
Yeah.
But yeah, knowing who's attending, and Facebook's just such a little tool because it's sending reminders to them. So that they're
Sure.
not, you know,
Great. That's good. Well, those are good thoughts. I think, what is best practice on attendance? I think you should be attending every meeting. That's the short answer. And if you are having quorum troubles and things, like there's some things going on there which we can't go into here, but is how many people do you need? Is it a big number or?
I actually had a question around that.
Yeah.
Does an organisation set their own quorum, or is it a legal expectation that it is a certain percentage of members?
It's not a legal expectation. It should be in your rules. So your rules should specify what the quorum will be, and it's going to be different for different organizations.
Okay.
But I'm curious because sometimes I think, sometimes I feel like people want big boards. We want 12 people on the board. We want 8 people or whatever. We've helped set up about 40 charities in the last year. So we're doing this almost 1 a week. And I had somebody come in the other day and say, good news, I found 13 people to be trustees. And I'm like, do you realize how hard it's going to be to organize meetings for 13 people? So I hadn't gone into this before, but I prefer smaller boards because I feel like they're more nimble, they're more able and capable. Not that you're not got lots of volunteers and people helping, but the core group is committed and smaller. And if it's an odd number like 5, then you can potentially have 3 and 2, if there needed to be a decision rather than 3 and 3 and you get the deadlock. But I guess this would be one question is, are we setting ourselves up for failure by thinking that we need to have 10 people at every meeting? And would it be better to just empower people to say, actually, you know what, for this season in our organization, we only need 3 people to meet or 5 people to meet. The rest of you have busy lives. We're going to rotate. And, for this year, it's the 5 of us. And then we're going to have people coming in next year and I'll step down and you step in. And so the point is there might be practical solutions. But of course, it's going to depend on your context. But my feeling is you should be attending every meeting. Yeah, start small.
Aren't you calling that white male?
I guess it depends who your shoulder tapping. Yeah.
just ask a group who wants to be involved, you're at shoulder tap, you are sort of. Obviously, the gap in the group.
Yeah, yeah, you're right, and there is a danger of unconscious bias, which is I like you because you're like me, and in all different areas as well. It's not just like me as a white middle-aged class person. It's also for smaller groups. You might have a bias to not choose me, you know. So I don't have an easy answer yet, but it's. I just see that if you're proactive, you're more likely to get people involved. And somebody who left before was saying, you know, for women, they might not feel like they could step into a position of leadership. But if somebody went and said, hey, let's have a catch up, I think you're amazing. The work you're doing with the children that you're supporting shows me that you could definitely step up into this role. I believe in you. That might be all that they need to say, I would love to serve. So, you know, I think there is a role there as well. Yeah. All right, and then we've already touched on setting a recurring time for the board meetings, circulating the agenda ahead of time. Shouldn't be the night before, should be at least a week. I like your idea, 2 weeks before, everyone knows. Sending the meeting minutes of the last time, confirming who's coming. Yeah, so the answers are on the page over like before. What are some ways to ensure meetings keep on track? We touched earlier on the role of the chair. So I think that's one of the primary roles of the chair is to say, okay, everybody, we've had a good discussion on item number 3. We're moving to item number 4. We've allocated this amount of time. Who wants to lead off with their thoughts? You know? And the other thing, time saving. You should expect that everybody is pre-read any material that's being provided. They shouldn't be sitting in the meeting going, oh, yeah, what are we talking, what is this about again? Like that should be a cultural expectation that you have for your board members, that you've already prepared so that you're ready to talk rather than flipping through trying to work out what's the topic. Yeah.
Just to build on that, we have listed next to our agenda items a specific person that's going to speak on that, so that the agenda item is read out and everyone looks around to be like, who wrote that? Who wrote it down? It saves a bit of time. Yeah, so you specified in the agenda who it is that's going to speak to that. Yeah, that's a great idea. Yep. All right. Yeah, you can read the rest of this later. And just for those who are new, I touched on this before, but how much time looking at the past, thinking about the present, looking at the future. Too often our boards are looking at the past rather than looking at the future. So as a rule of thumb, the past should take up like 25% of the time, but the future focus should be like 50% or 75% of the time. And quite often we get bogged down in what happened at the last event, when actually we should be thinking about what's the agenda for 5 years from now? What's the danger that we're not seeing? What's the iceberg ahead that we're going to crash into if we don't focus on it today? What's the role of ChatGPT for our organization? You know, like whatever it is, there's always going to be something new that you need to be thinking, oh yeah, this is interesting. Where are we headed? Yeah. So let's move on to number 3. So hey, your chair has attended an evening masterclass on governance. Things improved greatly at your second meeting. One item on the agenda is raised by another trustee who mentions that they want to look at how the organization uses its resources and deploys them as good stewards. Well, that I don't disagree with that sentiment, but let's see where we head. One area she wants your input on as trustees is whether you should switch the printing of the monthly notices from being on white paper, which costs 1 cent per sheet, to a new recycled paper, which costs 2 cents per sheet. Turns out there are lots of different views on this, and you notice the time is flying by. Pretty soon, 40 minutes have been spent, but you realize it's an important issue. Next on the agenda, should the group switch power provider? All right, so in your groups, why don't you run through these 3 questions? So why don't we come back together? It's good. I'm hearing lots of discussion, and hopefully you're learning from each other as well and able to articulate, you know,
your thoughts, because that's really good. So this one, maybe more for the benefit of those who just came, because I touched on this in the earlier part. The difference between governance and management. So basically, governance is the leadership, direction setting, really high level. You're in the helicopter flying high above, and you're the one saying, watch out, there's an iceberg ahead. Whereas management is more the day-to-day running the operations. So sometimes people get confused about what their role is, and it ends up being that the governance is doing the management and the management is doing the governance, or you're doing both. But if you're doing both, you just have to be clear, like, which hat am I wearing today? And it's okay to do both. In some organizations, you're looking at me going, what are you talking about? It's just us. There's no CEO, there's no management. We do everything. So if that's the case, that's fine, because that's what you are, but you probably need psychologically to be thinking, okay, we're putting on our hats of strategy now. Where are we going? And then taking off that hat, okay, now we're washing the dishes. You know, so psychologically it might help to have that distinction though for your groups. Yeah.
Just beyond the washing the dishes example, do you anticipate any conflict of interest between an individual doing both?
Yeah.
It can be a conflict. It usually comes back to money, and if the person is being paid, then it's a simple answer in that case is that they shouldn't be setting their own amount that they get paid. But I don't have a problem with someone being a trustee and also being employed or fulfilling the management function. As long as everyone's clear and accepting about it, it can be a really appropriate thing. And quite often when charities first begin, the founder might end up being a trustee and employed by the trust.
Quickly share an example. So where I worked in the not-for-profit sector, trustees were given consultancies on an exceptional basis.
Okay.
But in that instance, because they brought in those expertise, but in that instance, the board has to approve.
Yeah. Well, that's what I'm meaning is that it's an inherent conflict of interest. If, hey, everyone, Steven is a great person, we should employ him, and I'm Steven, you know, it's like, it's not, you can't do that. You have to have some separation. So the way it would happen is, Steven, can you leave the room? We are going to talk about who is employed and then make a decision. So the sanitizer for conflict, it's going to come up in a minute. The sanitizer for conflict is disclosure. That's how you get rid of it. Yeah. So yeah, where boards go wrong is they get too concerned with the nitty-gritty, the management. How do you stay focused? We've already touched on this in the earlier session, having an effective chair. I've put here as well, maybe you have subcommittees and the subcommittee goes off and investigates something and comes back. It doesn't have to be the whole board, but ultimately the board should make the decision. That's important to remember. If you've got subcommittees working, you can't abdicate responsibility for the decision by saying, well, the health and safety team handled that. You know, that's a specific example, but at the governance level, if you're that level, you're responsible. You can't say, wasn't me, that was the committee over there, they did it. Yeah. And then what is strategy? When should a board set that? So strategy is basically a plan to achieve a goal. It's pretty simple. A plan to achieve a goal. I think that boards should be setting strategy. This is interesting though, because like you mentioned your Facebook group, you know, meeting on a rhythm. At what point do you say, well, now we need to set strategy. So we're going to have a different type of meeting because it's the start of the year, or you know, it's the start of a new decade or something. We actually need to be thinking beyond the next month. Let's take out 1 day or 3 hours or whatever you can say, actually, it's time for us to have a strategy setting, you know, time away. If you have the time and the place, hey, let's let's get away from our normal way of doing this. We are going to meet wherever it is. We're going to Hamner Springs. You know, like we're getting completely out of our context. We're pushing ourselves aside, and we are going to focus on strategy. So quite often we get into the rhythm of the monthly meetings, you know, but it's important to remember setting strategy is good too. And then a challenge that I'd like to give you is, does your group have a 100-year strategy? Like, what does that look like? That's a challenge to me as well. Very often we are focused, because of the environment we've grown up in, it's like quarterly, yearly, you know, monthly. But if your organization has a purpose and a mission, then what does your organization look like in 2123? And what are you doing today that will help you get to that point? So this is the proverb, we're planting seeds of trees that we will not sit in the shade of. But if we have that mentality, I think it would change how we approach what we're doing. Again, to use a Te Ao Maori concept of kaitiakitanga, guardianship. We are here for the much longer perspective than the short term. And that's actually quite challenging and humbling, because, you know, we think we're going to be around forever, but we're not. We are guardians, we are stewards for a short time. And it shouldn't be about us as individuals, it should be about the mission and the purpose. So, yeah.
Practical question, because share that sentiment, how do you inculcate that into the trustees and so on?
I think you talk about it. I just think we just have to have a clear conversation. And maybe this is something you could do when you go back to your boards, is just say, hey, I was just at this governance thing, this crazy person was talking about 100-year plans. What would a 100-year plan be for our organization? And get people thinking. Yeah, like I said, I think we're too often short term. In my world, well, I'm really glad that some of you are here, because from an iwi perspective, I've got a lot of clients who are based in that conception of the world. For them, they have 100-year plans. They're thinking intergenerationally. So Naitahu is a great example. Actually, if you think about it, what they're doing, what they're building, is for generations. It's not about shareholder profit in the sense that a Western conception would think of it. It's about how do we build up for our people. But we can learn from that for each of our groups, which is what are we here for? And what does it look like 10 years, 50 years, 100 years from now? Yeah, it's a challenge to me personally, because, you know, I'm not going to be here 100 years from now. What is this law firm I'm working for? You know, like, how do I help to build in a culture there? In community finance, the company I'm involved in, how do I build in that culture there? I don't have all the answers. I just know if we talk about it, that's definitely a good step in the right direction.
Do you have to balance being realistic and too ambitious when you set such a long-term vision?
Yeah. So being realistic when you have a long-term vision, yeah, you do, but I think too often we limit ourselves by what we've known in the past. So I actually I hope that some of you listen to what I'm saying and you go back to your groups and you have even a 15-minute conversation. Like, what is our group here for? What does it look like 100 years from now? Because I think it does shift your perspective, and it should be challenging. Do we exist?
Maybe say who cares, they're not the next thing, that's generally going to be the response.
It might be, but at least you've started the thinking. Yeah, the seed. Yeah, I love the idea of seeds. Yeah.
I just wanted to circle back to what you just referenced, your earlier corridor around a for-purpose organisation. If you're working towards that purpose, eventually you won't be needed.
Yeah.
Because that purpose will have been fulfilled. Are we making a 100-year plan?
Yeah. Well, so the question is, if we have a 100-year plan, then are we going against what we said before, which is we might not exist. So my answer to you would be, it depends on the situation, because absolutely for some contexts, I would hope that the problem can be solved, and we should absolutely be aiming for that. So the 100-year plan might be, we will not exist 100 years from today. That's what we're striving for. That's what we're pushing for. But for some of our organizations, like for Sporting Group, you know, like we want our club, yeah, we want our club to be here strong and thriving with a healthy quorum attending every meeting 100 years from today. So that involves thinking great grandchildren are going to look at, you know, what we did in 2023. I just think we have to have a bigger vision of what our organizations stand for. And too often we're limiting ourselves to, we've got to survive this year or this pandemic or this emergency. So if any of this resonates with any of you, I've written a book called, this is more of a business side of things, but this is laying foundations for reimagining business, because I'm issuing this challenge to businesses as well, because I think they need to be on board with this also. Business should be leading the way in our society. It shouldn't be falling to charities to be the ones picking up the pieces. Too often businesses are focused on quarterly profits, but what would it look like for business? And some of you work for businesses. What if you went to your boss and said, what's our 100-year plan? Like, it's pretty challenging, but I think it would focus people in a really healthy way. So I actually brought some copies of this. Some of you may be interested, and I'm happy to give you a copy. Let's keep moving, because I want to make sure we get through all these parts. Part 4, this is the way we do things around here. You're feeling pretty confident. You're on to your 3rd meeting. The question is raised about a noticeable dip in giving during a recent lockdown, and whether there's enough money coming in to actually pay the staff. You hadn't realized things were running so close to the edge, or that this was an issue. But another trustee, who is also an accountant, seemed quite concerned. They are about to talk about their ideas, launching a fundraising drive, when the chair raises their hand and stops the other person in their tracks with, we don't talk about this. We don't need to talk about this more. There's a certain way we do things around here. Everything is fine. We need to move on. So for this one, don't go in your groups. Let's just run through it, because I think we've covered this in the earlier session. But what are the characteristics of a good chair? Have a look at the answers. Fosters frank discussions where all voices are heard, seeks input, streamlines the flow of the meeting. As I said in the earlier session, being chair does involve more responsibility. You also need to connect with management, communicate clearly. Why is board culture important? How do you help to improve it? Yeah, I think organizations reflect the leadership. So you're setting the tone for the organization by how you act and interact with each other. So that's why you should do your very best to set the tone in the proper way. Yeah, improving board culture involves mutual respect, accepting differing viewpoints. There may be differing opinions on how to achieve the goal, but you should always give each other the benefit of the doubt. You know, working towards a greater thing. I've already mentioned board charters, ongoing training. How about your role on, what is your key role on a board? I think it is this, to humbly serve while remaining confident in the value of your input. So you have a voice. You are there to add a perspective. And if you're the chair, that's what you want to draw out for people. All right, let's do part 5. As well as being involved in this group, you also run a small catering business. Do any of you run small catering businesses? You do? All right, well, this will be very applicable. You provide a high quality experience for your clients, preparing delicious cakes and platters for events. You're not the cheapest option, but the quality you offer far surpasses your competitors. Well, you think so. The group will be celebrating its 50th anniversary. We'll be inviting a number of guests to attend a ceremony, including local politicians, leaders, and others. As trustees, you engage in a discussion about the day, and you suggest that perhaps providing some food for those attending would be a good idea. Someone else suggests that it's not a good idea, it's a great idea, and asks if you can price up the quote. Before you can respond, the chair says they don't need to see a quote. they just ask if you would like to second a motion that your company is chosen for the catering. All right, why don't you talk to each other, just run through those 3 questions. So is there a conflict here? Should we turn to the person who it's a reality for? What do we think? Is it? Yeah, there is. Okay. Yeah, I think you're right. But the reality is, particularly in a society like New Zealand, we all wear multiple hats. So there will be conflict. The question is, how will you deal with the conflict, right? Because that's just the nature of a small place. You know, there's going to be times where there's conflict. So what you need to do, well, on the next page I've listed, the trustee may set out a process if there's a conflict, but the best practice is always simple. Declare the conflict. Disclosure is a sanitizer that cleans away the conflict. Excuse yourself from the discussions, voting can proceed, and you shouldn't be involved in that decision. It's really simple.
Yeah.
One of the things that I think people forget is that it's not just monetary conflict. So that's kind of obvious, like you're going to get paid money. But what about the situation where your group is looking to employ someone and the person that is being employed looks like a good candidate and you have a robust discussion around the boardroom table and you all agree this is the right person, and that person gets employed, they come in and they greet one of your fellow trustees with hugs and kisses. And it's because it's their niece, you know, like that's not a monetary conflict as such, but it's definitely a conflict if they didn't disclose that the person you're thinking of employing is their niece or nephew or whatever it is. So the point is, just be on the lookout for more than just, oh, there's $100 payment here. It's also interpersonal, things that might go under the radar.
In a scenario like that, though, if you declare that that person's niece, then that clouds the judgment of hiring, whereas they're not just then being hired on their own merit, but the best persons who not declaring it gives all candidates an even playing field.
Oh, well, that's an interesting perspective. I guess I would disagree with that, because what I would say is you should declare it. And then when it comes time to making the decision, you might excuse yourself and not be involved in that.
The board would be the people choosing.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so that niece gets hired. Is it now any decision around that person or the project that person is involved in? Is that now considered a conflict of interest too with the person on the board?
Well, you've disclosed it, so everyone knows. I think if it's a project that they're heading up, that probably wouldn't be a conflict. Like if they're doing a new program for preschool children or something, I don't think that would be a conflict. Just the fact that it's your niece, because you disclosed it, they were the best candidate, they were hired. But if it came to, there's some performance issues with this person and we need to exit them from the organization, there's probably going to be back in the conflict situation. Yeah. So hopefully that never happens, but you know, that's the nature of these things. Is, I mean, to be honest, when people approach me to get legal work, and they're my close friend, I actually find it much harder to give them good legal advice because there's a connection. So usually what I'll say is, we're very happy to help you, but I'm going to get my colleague to help you because it's just easier. You don't have to, worry about it. And if any of you are in startup world and you're raising money, it's very common to raise money from family and friends. But let me tell you, when you're passing the potatoes at Christmas and your surefire investment didn't work out, that's a really hard conversation to have with Aunt Mabel, who put in 15,000 on your assurances. So generally for startups, I would not necessarily get money from your family and friends because I've seen it damage relationships. And in my book, relationships are more important than money. So sometimes it's better to approach people who you're not actually related to because they can judge it based on, you know, the worthiness of the cause. So side topic, but you never know. Some of you might be or one day will be entrepreneurs. So I've seen that come up before where, like I said, it's a really hard conversation at the next family gathering. What should you do if you disagree with the decision? I think that you should note it in the minutes. Like there should be a record that you didn't agree. And actually, it's not so often relevant in this area, the for purpose area, but in company contexts, it can become really important if there was a case brought. So there's quite a big case where an ex-prime minister of New Zealand was involved, and the fact that some of the directors objected to things and it was noted in the minutes, that affected their liability later on when the judge was looking and said, well, this person objected, and then they resigned. So they're not as liable as these people who nodded and agreed. Yeah, so that's the case of Mainzeal, if anybody's interested. So they had $130 million that was lost in 2013. So Jenny Shipley, the ex-prime minister, was the chair of that board. All right, let's keep moving. We're nearly there. Structure, options, and strategy. At your next meeting, a proposal comes to the board to endorse the setting up of a counseling service, which will focus on people recovering from drug addictions. Sounds good. The plan is for this to come under the banner of the trust. And so the chair explains that they've talked with their local GP, who identified that there was a need for more counselors. It's just an oral report without any analysis on the market, the details of what this might involve. No one on the board has any experience in counseling or addictions, but they all have a desire to help others. Seems like a kind thing to do. The chair explains that you will now be directly overseeing this new initiative as a board, with the new premises leased somewhere not yet decided, staff employed, well, not yet decided, and policies developed, well, not yet decided. For simplicity, the new initiative will not come under a separate entity. Everyone nods at this and raises their hand to signal approval, but you wonder if it's the best way. You hesitate, and you can tell that the chair sees that hesitation. So should you speak up? Hopefully the answer is easy, yes. Yeah, this is one of the dangers of groupthink. If all the board members are saying, great, sounds wonderful, and it comes back to that first one. But if there's a dominator in a group, so your job is to say, what about this? What about that? So you should speak up. What are the dangers of this sort of approach? Yeah, at the extreme end, it could result in personal liability. The board clearly, nobody on the board has any experience in counseling, and you're about to embark on setting up a counseling service for people with drug addictions. Like, there's no ability to say, we know what we're doing here. You need to get more information. And then from a legal perspective, it's actually a problem if you're putting new initiatives under your existing umbrella of an organization. And that's because we call it, in legal terms, ring fencing liability. So if you're setting up something new, it's usually a good idea to set up a new entity or to have it come under a different banner. So in this context, it might be that you set up a company, and the company is 100% owned by the charity, and that company then does what you're going to do. The reason is that if it fails, like it sounds like this might, it's not going to drag down the charity with it because it's separate. Legal liability is limited within the company. The other thing, if you did do that, if you had a separate company, it would register as a charity as well because it's 100% owned. And what you might find is that, and this is a little hint for some of you, you might find that you could get additional funding if you had different entities, because funders may not, what they're looking at is a charity applying. They're not necessarily going in all the detail of what's the interrelationship between this charity and that charity. So it can be a way to open up funding streams to have more than one legal entity to further the purpose. And from my perspective, it's always about impact and purpose first. What type of legal entity you have should come second. So another alternative, this might come as a shock, but maybe you need a for-profit entity, which is set up a company. which actually achieves mission and purpose. And through what it does and who it employs, maybe it's the ex-drug addicts who are suddenly employed in a cafe. That might fit under a business structure rather than a charitable structure. So I often help people set up hybrid structures where you have a charity and a for-profit business.
Would funding still be allocated to the new entity, or could you use that to support the overarching organization?
It depends what the funding criteria are, I guess. Generally, it would need to go to the initiative that's being funded rather than passing through.
Five entities and then have them all funded through your.
Yeah, I think they would see through that.
Yeah,
And but if you legitimately had a business which was helping drug addicts or whatever, then it might be that that was a separate thing that you could get funding for in addition to your main entity. So I view legal entities more like tools in the tool shed. And you go into the tool shed because you need to hammer in some nails. You shouldn't get the saw to hammer in the nails, but you should get the hammer. And if you want to cut off the tree from a branch, you shouldn't get the hammer, you should get the saw. So legal entities, it might be not relevant, but equally, it might be relevant at some point to think about having different legal structures that all are about the mission and purpose where you're headed. And Rata Foundation, they might very happily fund the charitable trust. They might also very happily fund the limited liability company, which is owned by the charitable trust. Yeah, so just ideas to throw out. Some of this is dealt with here. There's a group called the Akina Foundation, which does great work in a topic. Some people call it social enterprise. I wrote a book called Social Enterprise in New Zealand, so I'm an advocate for the principles, but I'm no longer using the term social enterprise as much as I was. I'm using the term impact companies. So hence the laying foundations for reimagining business, what it could be. Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
About this in particular.
Yep.
Say everybody agreed that it was a terrible decision and they all voted no.
Yep.
Do you, as chair, have a duty to explore the other option, or do you just accept everybody's unanimous decision?
By the other option, what do you mean? Like
Well, after way, I suppose, if everybody unanimously agreed, no, we won't set up this counselling service, do you have a duty to explore the yes? And then if everybody voted yes,
I think you just move on. Yeah, I mean, if everybody's saying no, I would just. We looked at the idea and we said no, so moving on. All right, part 7 is the last one, which is it was signed when. So if someone mentions the trustee during your meeting and makes you curious about what it is, you're surprised you can download for free. You see your name is listed as an officer. When you open it, you see it's dated 1972. It appears to have been prepared on a typewriter. You laugh to yourself thinking of that era before computers. So much has changed, but reading the language, it does make you wonder if it's still up to date. It starts like this. In witness whereof the parties hereunto have set their hands to these presents as a deed on the day, month, year, hereinbefore mentioned. You smile at that, but then you look through and you realize the entire document is similar. And you can't see a reference to things like trustee liability or indemnities. You recall attending an evening masterclass on governance. Wasn't there a mention of a Trust Act 2019, which reformed this area of law? You feel a tightening in your stomach and you wonder if your trust deed is still even adequate. All right, so should you ask questions of the chair? Yes, it's the easy answer. Yeah, you need to ensure that your trust deed is reflecting how you actually act. That it's fit for purpose. And I view these as not fixed moments in time. They should be like organic growing things. Over time, your organization's needs will change.
Yeah.
You should change them too. I'm dealing with one right now. I think it was signed in 1929, like literally 100 years ago. So it definitely needs help. And then what are the key points you would want to ensure are covered? Yeah. On the other side, you can see that it reflects how you actually operate, that it's reflective of your purpose, that the powers and duties are clear, how you appoint and remove trustees, how you amend it, how you wind it up. So does anybody have anything that they would like to ask about what we've gone through there tonight? I know it's a lot of content, but hopefully it will allow you to just take a breath, reflect, and then go back to your organizations. Yeah.
So my main question was around decision making.
Yeah.
Currently our process is that an item is raised, that person speaks on it. From that, hopefully a motion can be made. Now originally a motion was made, one person moved it, one person seconded it, and that was it.
Yeah.
At some point somebody wanted to vote, so we now would make a motion, hold a vote, and note the objections, abstentions.
Yeah.
Then once that vote was majority or unanimous, then it would be moved, then it would be seconded. Are we overcomplicating it?
Well, it sounds to me like it's overcomplicated the way
Yeah.
you're describing it. So the basic principle is you're just trying to work out what does everybody think, right?
Yeah.
And actually, I'm writing an article right now on this point about who proposes it, who seconds it. Because if you look from a legal perspective, there's nothing about that. That's something that we have made up.
Right.
And I think it actually sometimes overcomplicates it. You know how we go around the table and like, who would like to move it and who would like to second it? That's something that we have, for some reason, crept into our culture.
Yeah.
But it becomes very bureaucratic. It becomes quite politicized.
Yes.
But it's not actually needed. Like I just had one of my law grads researching this the last few days. There's someone who some of you may know, Mere Went, up in Wellington. She's an amazing Pacifica person involved in governance. And she's the one who provoked me to ask this question, because she said, Stephen, why is it that we have who was, proposing, who seconds? Is it a legal requirement? And my conclusion, having looked at it, is no, it's not. It's a self-imposed requirement. And I don't think we actually need it. So I'm writing an article now for Institute of Directors about this, because I think it does overcomplicate things. And actually, what I would prefer is that it's usually, hopefully, there is consensus around the table. And you are aware of that because you had a really good discussion. Everyone aired their views. And now, okay, it looks like the room, as a chair, looks like everyone's agreeing. Jane, what did you think? Okay, that's good to know. All right, well, looks like we need to take a vote. Who's in favor, who's against, and it's passed. And if it's really contentious, let's record who voted against it. But I would be keeping it simple rather than complicating it.
So we currently have someone sitting on our board that also sits on the board for Naga or Naitahu.
Okay.
And she said that that's how they do things at their meeting. And when I asked why, she said that's just always how they've done it.
Yeah, and I believe that answer. I believe the answer is this is how we do things around here.
Okay.
But I think that as board members, part of our responsibility is to question, why do we do things this way? Why do we start this way? I mean, and another example is why on the agenda do we always put minutes, approving minutes of the previous meeting? Like, why do we start our meetings with that?
So we don't have to do that.
No, it's not a legal requirement, but this is the thing, like we can reconceive governance in a way that is applicable and relevant for our organizations. It's good practice to confirm the minutes, but maybe you do that as the last item on the meeting or, some other place. So, yeah. Yeah. Well, but that's a really important point. That's the way it's always been done. And so we just keep going. If any of you are joining boards or you're about to get into governance, you have a superpower when you first join, which is, why do you do it this way?
Yeah.
That's the perfect moment to be asking these questions. And we get so into the rhythm of it, but we always do it this way. We always meet at this particular place at this time. We've never considered changing the meeting to be, I'm just throwing out ideas, right? But maybe the attendance point that you're talking about, maybe it would be better if we held it as a breakfast meeting, because people could fit that in their day better, or a lunch meeting, or whatever after the game, when everybody's there anyway, we're just going to take time for it. So as new members of boards, please ask questions, push people and say, yeah, but why? Yeah, but why? Not too annoying though, but like, I think that's okay. That's what we're there for.
And anyone could propose or motion an idea. It doesn't have to be the chair or a.
Yeah, I don't think so. Yeah, could be. Yeah. Oh, there you go.
So even when you're electing officials at the AGM, should you still first second it or?
I don't think you need to.
Not even bother?
No, I don't think you need to. I think it's crept in. Maybe as humans, we just like bureaucracy, just we like, and maybe maybe it's appropriate if somebody like spent 6 months writing a paper about this new plan and you want to acknowledge that they're the ones. So would, Lisa, would you like to propose this or something? Like, I can see there might be a reason, but for most things, I don't think you would need to have it. And I'm guilty of this too, because I'm on boards where we still do who proposes it, who seconds it. But I'm about to change all that. So
very quickly, does that apply to if we were sworn on public servants and councils or on councils?
I haven't investigated that. I guess it's possible there's different rules, but not that I know. Yeah, we were looking more from a corporate perspective, like what does companies law say? What does the Trust Act say? So I guess it's possible there would be something in local legislation, but not that I know of. So yeah, be one to look into. Yeah.
This the book of minutes reminded me, does it actually have to be a physical book still? Or?
I think it could be digital. Yeah, I think that would be fine. Yeah, I think we're beyond needing paper for everything.
Can it be email?
Yeah, can it be email?
Email or should it be an actual document?
Well, I guess the email would have the minutes, so therefore it would be, that would be fine.
But what I mean is, instead of writing it, say in a Word document, we just put it in an email.
Yeah, if everyone agrees, then sure. Yeah, could be.
There is software that's specifically designed for boards.
Diligent board members.
Yeah, Diligent is one. Board Pro is another one. One of the companies I'm on, we use Board Pro, so it holds everything there, all the minutes and everything. So yeah. So I'm gonna finish up now because I think we're there. Maybe one last thought, or I will. Yeah, we have it as a digital copy, and yeah, there's lots of clickable links. And one thing I'd encourage you, like the reason I come and do this session is because I want to empower you all to now, please don't sit on the knowledge you've got today. Can you please take it back to your board members? And if you know someone else on a board, would you be willing to forward the guides to them and say, hey, you should look at it? Because this thing, what I'm actually hoping is that boards would go through it together. So maybe at the start of your meetings, you would go through scenario number 1, and then the next meeting, you'd go through scenario number 2, and then the next meeting, scenario number 3, to upskill people in governance. So that's kind of how I think it could be used. But it's like all resources. It's only useful if people actually find out about it. So I can't tell the people that you know, but if you're willing to tell people, then, it's going to spread, which I think would be good. And also I mentioned, for those of you who came in, I'll give you a card. I'm doing a podcast called Seeds, and it would be great if you were willing to be unofficial ambassadors for Seeds, in that people I don't know. There's 346 interviews with inspiring people. So it's all content that might be helpful. And the thing I didn't say at the last one is I'm holding a conference in October. It's going to be all online. It's called the Seeds Impact Conference. So the theme is to go fast, go alone, to go far, go together. And I've got more than 160 groups who've given their logos to support it. But I would love for more people to find out about it. It's going to be $20 for an all-day conference with some really high class people, including 3 former mayors of Christchurch. So Leanne Dalzell, Gary Moore, and Vicky Buck. and a whole bunch of other people. So I'll send a link that maybe you can send to the people who attended this, and
Yeah,
they can find out. So thank you. Really appreciate the chance to share, and hope it was interesting, and get you thinking maybe.
Well, apart from the fact that my